Now next up, we're going to be covering one of the most important components of computer science, so make sure you pay attention, because next up we're going to be covering variables, what they are and how we use them. First of all, what exactly is a variable? A variable is simply something that can store information and can be referenced and manipulated. Think of variables like a cardboard box. Cardboard boxes serve as a mean to store items in them which can be changed out, replaced and modified. Like I said, variables are like cardboard boxes that store information for the programmer to reference, manipulate or refer to. Each variable simply has a type, a name and a piece of information stored inside of it. The type and piece of information will be covered next, and the name is simply a name for the variable. Think of it as writing out a label on the cardboard box. Now there are many different types of variables that a programmer can use, but right now we will be just covering what are called primitive variables, which includes integers, booleans, floats, doubles, strings and chars. Well, we start off talking about integer. An integer, or int for short, is as simple as it sounds, a variable that can store an integer value. This includes all whole numbers, from this big number in negative that you can see on the display right now, till this another positive big number that you can see on the screen right now. Now notice how I said whole numbers. Integer variables cannot and will not hold any decimal values, so keep that in mind when using variables. Secondly is a boolean. A boolean is a very primitive variable which can store a value of either true or false. Boolean variables can only hold these two values and are extremely useful for conditional statements, which we will cover soon. The next two types of variables are floats and doubles. Both of these variable types are floating point data types, which essentially means that these variables can store numbers with decimal places. Whereas integer values cannot hold decimal values, floats and doubles can. The main difference between the two is that a float variable can store numbers of a precision up to 32-bit, while double can store numbers with precision up to 64-bit. Essentially, a double can store more decimal places than a float, so it all comes down to how precise you want the variable to be. Up next we have string variables, which are like the strings we actually talked about beforehand, except stored somewhere in a value. String variables can store strings of letters, which are just words and sentences. Strings are useful for displaying text and storing input information. Strings can also be concatenated together to form combinations of string variables and pre-written strings. This is very useful for outputting information in a readable format for the user. For example, imagine that we have a string called name. The code asks for input and stores that string of text in name. To output this information to the user, rather than simply displaying their name, you can add the phrase "your name is" and make it into a sentence by concatenating "your name is" plus name. This makes it easier to read your code while also adding variability to your code, which always makes things more interesting for the end user. Finally, we have char variables. Char stands for character, and just as the name suggests, they can each hold on one character. This is useful when a programmer wants to read one button press or one character in a string without using a string variable. A specific example is making a game that is controlled by the keyboard. The program needs to recognize the character that it's pressed and translate that into carrying out some function. Now, strings can also hold one character, but chars can hold more than one character. But chars cannot hold more than one character, so keep that in mind when defining variables. Now, why are variables so useful? Well, being able to store information in a format that can be easily referenced later is essential for any good program. Oftentimes in code, you are going to want to keep track of things such as a username or score. And so by creating a variable called name or score, you can store this information in that variable and then reference it, add to it, or modify it. Also, many times the program will take input from the user which cannot be programmed into the code, and this variable is required to store the information. A program may also rely on factors that will change as the program progresses, in which case a variable is once again required. Also, taking these variables and manipulating them is quite necessary for carrying out many of the tasks you want a program to carry out. For instance, multiplying int variables or concatenating string variables. Overall, variables are the backbone of any good program, and you will find yourself using them often if you want clean and efficient code. So it's best that you learn what types of variables you need to use and when. So now that we know all about the different variable types and we have talked about them a little bit, now we're going to delve further into what happens when we actually define or create a variable. But this we are gonna be covering in the next lecture. See ya then.